Hello everyone. So this is the notes that we went over in class today. We went over the relationships between aspects of an ecosystem. We went over soil and symbiotic relationships and fungi. So we covered a lot. The first thing that we did was we read about what happened when the bison were effectively taken out of an ecosystem. And so we read this little bit that was part of Appetite of Abundance on the benefits of being eaten that we read a few weeks ago. And what we found was with the vanishing of the bison began the slow fade of an estimated 100 million wallows that the pawing, rolling animals eroded into the grasslands, creating ephemeral water pools in the wet seasons and dust basins in the dry. As the wallows declined, so did the spadefoot and Great Plains toads that gathered to breed in them. So did the grassland song of the western chorus frog, so did birds like the McCown's longspur and the mountain plover. The latter so fond of prairie balds that they're now known to nest with predictable risk on farmers' bare fields. Without bison calves and carcasses to feed on, the plains grizzly faded not only from the landscape, but also from memory. Gone, too, is the strange reciprocal relationship between bison and prairie dogs, with the bison mowing down the grass to make way for prairie dog colonies, which in turn improve the quality of forage for bison. The two animals' fates were joined. Wild bison now roam just 1% of their former range. Prairie dogs number 2% of their former population. The buffalo bird, which once fed on insects spooked into the air by bison herds, simply came up for a name change. Today, it's the cowbird. So what we did was we went through that story that was told and drew out the story of this ecosystem. So the bison, what they would do is stomp on the ground so much that it really compacted the soil and created these spaces that they call, what did they say? They said wallows and ephemeral water pools in the wet season and dust basins in the dry. So in the wet season, this area that's compacted, actually the water can't go down into the soil, and so it collects water. Because of this, the spadefoot and Great Plains toads, they would usually lay their eggs in here and find a lot of habitat in here, as well as the chorus frog, and they weren't able to do that anymore. In addition, insects aren't able to breed in this water anymore either. Now, in the dry season, these become these dust basins, which birds really like. So the longspur and the plover were no longer able to nest in these areas. Also no longer to eat the eggs of the frogs or the insects. And so having the bison taken out of this ecosystem had this compounding effect. The other thing that it talks about is how the plains grizzly bear used to feed on the carcasses, so the dead bison. Now, the plains grizzly bear, I had never heard of it until reading this. I'm from the plains originally. I lived in Kansas for a while, and there are no grizzly bears. There was also the prairie dogs that burrowed, and they have had a relationship with bison, still do, that they would burrow in the space and spread the seeds, spread the roots, loosen up the soil that the bison would, that the grass that grew here, the bison would feed on, and it would actually make the grass healthier and better. And now that that bison essentially exists, let's see, they said 1% of their former range. There is now 2% of the former population of prairie dogs. Okay, so we did that, and then we looked back at this energy flow and nutrient cycle from a few weeks ago. And we talked about how, like this is an energy change. This is not actually a food web. Food chains, something we'll hear sometimes, don't really exist. A chain is something where everything is linked, but it just goes down along in a line. A web instead is something where things cross over each other. So in actuality, though this is the way the energy flows, the web is going to be, yes, the primary consumers, like the mice, eat the plants, but also birds eat plants. And the mouse may actually feed on a dead snake or a dead bird. Yes, the bird will eat snakes, but the bird also eats mice. So that is a food web. The other thing is that we haven't really gone over the FBI, the fungi, bacteria, and insects that are the main decomposers, or that are the decomposers of the world. So we went into that right here. So we talked about soil and how there's this entire ecosystem underground that we don't necessarily see. The idea is that they are decomposing, that the creatures are decomposing and making soil. So they're breaking down biotic or abiotic into simpler chemicals and elements. We talked about how soil is made up of biotic and abiotic materials. So biotic would be living or once living. So they're creatures and like dead plant matter. So like leaves, right? Abiotic is non-living. So nutrients, rocks, water, and air. And these are what soil is made out of. Now, decomposing is the biotic breaking down biotic and abiotic materials. All right, solid. So we looked at some soil. We've got grass here, we've got a tree, we've got a shrub, and all of these roots kind of combine and actually form a web of sorts, an interconnected network underground. Now there's also bacteria. In 1 teaspoon of soil, there's 100 million to 1 billion bacteria. Bacteria are single-celled organisms. They convert nutrients so that plants can use them. They also decompose things. So bacteria is all over the place. Now, there's also nematodes, which are grazers. They will eat bacteria, they'll eat fungi, they'll eat the roots. Sometimes they'll cause diseases, but they're also grazers, they're also nematode-eating nematodes. Some nematodes are microscopic, others can be up to 7 meters long. They're massive. A lot of the ones that we have in our soil, though, are microscopic, or we can maybe see them, they're like this big. So that is nematodes. They are also helping to decompose. Now there's some larger stuff too, like ants and worms and centipedes, and they burrow through and increase the air, the oxygen in the soil. The oxygen is super important because nematodes and bacteria both need oxygen. They also, the worms and ants and centipedes and such, also carry bacteria over long distances and pass soil through their bodies to further decompose it. In addition, we've got burrowing animals. This is a shrew here. And they will make the soil texture better by loosening it up. And also like pooping down there, right? Making more stuff to decompose and with different nutrients in it. Then we have in the Pacific Northwest, some of the most important decomposers are snails and slugs. There's also these millipedes, and what you'll see is these black millipedes with like bright yellow and bright orange dots on the sides. And they can be about this big, and they are cyanide producing millipedes. They produce cyanide on the sides of their body so that they are toxic to creatures who try to eat them. And in our forest here, they eat and decompose 33 to 50% of the leaf litter. We're also in a moment going to get into fungi, which is actually kind of what makes this whole system work. But before we do that, let's talk about symbiotic relationships. This whole thing here going on is symbiotic relationships. Similarly, oh, that's the wrong page. This is symbiotic relationships. So we're going to go down here. Symbiosis is two or more organisms that live together, in which the relationship benefits one or both organisms. There are 5 different kinds of symbiotic relationships, and then each of these, there's like a lot more underneath it. So there's mutual, and an example of that, so both parties within this one benefit. An example of that is the prairie dogs and the buffalo. Okay? There's commensalism, where one benefits and the other one isn't harmed. So when we go back to this, that may be talking about the frog and the buffalo, because the frog is benefiting from the water, right? But the buffalo isn't necessarily, that we know of, benefiting from the frog. So then there's predation, where one creature is eating another. So that's the birds eating the eggs of the frog or eating the insects. There's parasitism, where one is actually feeding off of the other and harming it. So this isn't necessarily, we didn't really go over this within the buffalo scenario, but an example of this is orchids. Orchids will actually feed off of other plants, and they need fungi to do that. There's also parasitic nematodes that exist. So then there's competition as the last one. And these are going to be competing for the same nutrients and energy. So that's like birds competing for the same nutrients and energy. And if there's too much competition, then it's going to threaten both species, and one may come out on top. Right. Next up, and the final stuff that we went over, is fungi. So when we go back to here, we're looking at how the fungi actually create this network throughout this larger network of roots. So when we see fungi, oftentimes what we see is a mushroom. Now I made this dotted drawing of a mushroom. When we see mushrooms, it's the fruiting body of the fungi. So fungi are actually not plants, and they're not animals. For a while, Western science is like, oh, mushrooms are a type of plant. Not true. Mushrooms are actually closer in relationship to animals. So their fruiting body is the mushroom. But the mushroom itself is actually made up of hyphae, which are tubular structures. They absorb nutrients and bacteria, and they transport water and nutrients, also chemicals. So you can watch these videos of these tubular structures actually putting nutrients back and forth. They're pretty fascinating. And then underground, or in the log, or whatever the mushroom is or the fungi is growing on, this massive tubular structure that comes together, when it becomes this like mat or a web, it's called mycelium. And there is one massive mushroom that is that's 3.5 miles wide. It's in Oregon, in, oh man, I'm not remembering exactly where, but it's on the east side of the Cascades. It's called like fungus humungus or something, but its common name is the honey mushroom, which is an edible mushroom. So they can be up to 3.5 miles wide, covering this massive area. That's the largest one that humans know of right now that's been documented. Okay, so why fungi is important? There's a lot of reasons, but one is this thing called the Wood Wide Web. And the Wood Wide Web is a mycorrhizal relationship, which is a relationship between between fungi and plants. What's happening is we've got the roots of the plants, and the fungi, the hypha from the fungi, will actually enter in and infiltrate the roots of the plants. What they do is the fungi will feed off of the sugary food that the plants produce, and the plants will, in exchange, get nutrients and water. Let's see. Plants apparently will store around 20% of their energy, so that sugary food, to exchange with fungi so that they can get these things. Another thing that they do is they will send out chemical signals through this wood wide web, through the mycorrhizal relationship. So reasons that we know this are trees from one area being attacked by a predatory wasp, and the trees will start to send out something that will protect them from the wasp. And then a ways away, another tree will start to send out those same chemicals, even though they have not been attacked by that wasp yet. And then what some folks found was that that chemical that was in that tree was also in the fungi that made a connection between these trees. So pretty cool. Mycorrhizal relationship. So when you are looking at your capstone projects, think about the ways that soil is interacting with your plant or animal or whatever you've chosen. And then think about the symbiotic relationships that exist. And then if we look way back at this is an example. Say you chose the buffalo. This is an example of a story that is created. This is the buffalo's story. Now there's a lot more to this buffalo story, but this is how the buffalo interacts with the ecosystem, or part of it. Similar to the spadefoot toad. So if you chose a spadefoot toad, you could try to tell this story through a collage. All right, that's what I got for you.